And you might want to read what he said about the heroine Constance Armstrong, because that just touched my heart so deeply.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read that. This is the recent review from Southern Partisan magazine. It says, Morton offers characters whose steadfastness, faith, and courage make them models of emulation. How many other present-day novels can be similarly praised? The reviewer writes of the book's heroine, Constance Armstrong. It is Constance, whose name is surely symbolic of her physical and spiritual fortitude, who pushes the Armstrongs through the horrors of the war. And while she loses much of her family by the end of the novel, her own endurance is not only a personal triumph, but a triumph of the values which have been instilled in her by her family and her region. Constance, while a woman of inordinate passion, remains chaste throughout the novel, never once compromising herself, and thus becomes even more impressive. Morton is to be commended for creating a fascinating character of such moral clarity and transparent strength. Constance Armstrong is the kind of woman not readily found in the pages of contemporary fiction. Now, you say here that you actually have a moral message to teenagers here.
Well, I think Constance really does have a message to, she was 18 when the book opened. She's a teenager, and she's very bright and intelligent. She's headstrong. But she's been raised as a Christian. Her family is in the Episcopal Church, and as we follow her through the book, she's frustrated, first of all, that she can't be more involved in politics. It's a bit of a woman's message here that she would like to be, but because of her gender, she cannot be. But that doesn't really stop her, because she writes for the local newspaper. And when the war begins, she's very strong, involved in the politics. She's a Virginian, and she believes in the legality of secession. But her family has freed their slaves. You know, slavery is not the issue here for her. But as her family's financial situation goes downhill, Constance is the strong person who really takes over and keeps them afloat. She opens a bookstore in their house to keep them going financially, and really supports the family. But most important about Constance, I think, is her Christian compassion. Her father has been arrested by the Union Army on a very trumped-up charges, and he has been thrown into prison in Washington. And so she hates this Union Army. And yet one Union soldier is kind to her family and gives them safe passage to the town of Culpeper. And after the Battle of Cedar Mountain, when the town is full of wounded Union soldiers, her mother, who is very bitter, forbids Constance to bring any wounded Union soldiers into their home. But she discovers this young man unconscious on a wagon out in the street with no place to go, with several other wounded soldiers. So against the objections of her family, she brings these Union soldiers into her home and takes care of them. And she, again, quotes the parable, Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. This is our Christian duty to do this. Wow. And by doing this, she ultimately finds that this young man, God has brought them together, and he will become the love of her life. But she shows compassion throughout the book. Because she has the bookstore and she has the financial means to buy food when the Union Army occupies the town, she's in a better position than most of the other people in the town of Culpeper. And when the Union Army leaves, pretty much everybody else is starving. They don't have much to do with her, because she's been seen with a Union soldier. But she still gives them food. She sets the food out each night on her doorstep, and it disappears during the night. And she knows they're too proud to come to her, but she's still there feeding them. And although she and this soldier are, are very, very deeply and passionately in love, they respect one another. And the moral message here, I think, for teenagers is you can feel passion, but you can still feel restraint, and save sex for the sanctity of marriage. And I think that's a message that this generation needs to hear.
I'm just touched there when you just talk about her leaving food out there. But Jesus said to Peter, do you love me? After Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. And he asked him that 3 times. And then Jesus told, Peter said, yes, I do. And Jesus told him, feed my sheep. And I think about that in terms of, sharing the good news of the gospel, but also just meeting people's needs, letting them, meeting that whatever their needs are, let them experience that love, their worldly needs, and then, share the good news too of, just eternal life too. Tell me about some of the soldiers, and why is your book in memory of Frank Stringfellow?
Well, when I was researching the book, I discovered some very inspiring soldiers. And we all know about, of course, the leading Christian soldiers. We know about Robert E. Lee, who is such a shining example, and Stonewall Jackson. But there were many others that I thought people didn't know about that I wanted them to learn about. And the one who touched me the most was a Culpeper native by the name of Frank Stringfellow. And Frank grew up on a 1,000-acre plantation at Raccoon Ford. And he was a rather small fellow, and he had been sick prior to the outbreak of the war, and he stood 5'8", and he only weighed about 100 pounds. He really was very emaciated. But he had such a strong spirit that when the war broke out, he was very determined that he was going to defend his home, and he wanted to fight with the cavalry, which was going to be the most elite group. And when they looked at him, they rejected him, and he was just, mortified that they would turn him down. But he had such a wonderful sense of humor. He could always laugh at himself. And he said at a time when they were taking everybody with a head and a horse, they turned him down flat. But his ingenuity and his determination were so amazing that he finally, he was rejected over and over again. He learned that the Powhatan cavalry was camped in the woods outside of Culpeper. And so he had a scheme that he said is going to either get me killed or in the cavalry. And with his 2 pistols drawn, he crept into the woods and he managed to capture the careless pickets. And so at gunpoint, he paraded them into the center of the camp. And the commanding officer said, "Well, young man, what is the meaning of this?" And he said, "Well, sir, I just want to fight, and no one will take me because I'm so thin. But if I can do this to your men, just think what I can do to the Yankees." Well, that's how he got started. Literally, it was his determination that got him even into the Army. And Jeb Stuart learned this story about Stringfellow, and he did lots of other things that Stuart heard about. And ultimately, Jeb Stuart asked Frank Stringfellow to join a very elite group of scouts and spies, which was certainly the most dangerous mission in the Army, and he just knew no fear. I think because his faith was so strong, and he knew he was saved through Jesus Christ. He did not fear death, and he dared to do things that we would consider absolutely insane. And I think he provided probably more information for the Confederate Army than any man. In fact, after the war, General Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, wrote that in his particular line of work, that Frank Stringfellow did more than any one man for the Army of Northern Virginia. But you watch him do things that you're so amazed. But just to give you one example, there was a battle across the Rapidan River, and his mother was in her house right along the river, and an artillery shell exploded and wounded her in the foot. And after the battle, he went across the river, even though that side of the river was occupied by Union forces, to try to find his mother. She wasn't at home, but he found raggedy bandages on her bed, so he knew she'd been wounded. He was desperate to see her. And finally, a messenger came into the Confederate line. One of their servants got a message to him that she was at the farm Summerduck, which is still standing, and that she had been wounded. Well, he went to Jeb Stuart and asked Jeb Stuart permission to go to try to see his mother. And Stuart told him he was absolutely crazy, that that house was completely surrounded by an encampment of Union forces. And didn't he know they were just trying to draw him there to trap him? Mm-hmm. It was insane. And Stringfellow he wouldn't back down. He says, "My mother is everything to me. My father died when I was 3 years old. I love her. I'm going to go see her." And finally, Stuart ultimately gave his permission, because he knew he was going to go even if he didn't give his permission. And he had the audacity to do that, and he dressed as a woman, snuck through the Union soldiers in the hall, and spent 3 days visiting his mother.